Thank you very much, Bob. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As said, this morning we'll kick it off about some nutritional requirements of the current broiler breeder, and also how these requirements have changed over time. During the presentation, I will make probably a little bit more clear that nowadays we are focusing more and more on the body composition of the broiler breeder, since that's also affecting the requirements a lot. And we also have seen that body composition is changing over time, not only in the rearing period, but also based on more recent findings, also on the laying period, and also that can have an effect on how we should feed the current broiler breeder. When you look a little bit over time, we see, based on some published trials, that body composition is also changing over time, with the biggest changing actually in fat deposition. If we look at the percentage, then the percentage of protein has not increased or changed a lot over the recent years. We still see there is a progress in both the breeder and also the broiler performance, but as such the protein composition, the percentage of protein is actually not changing a lot. What we see more recently is that fat levels tend to go up a little bit again, which is mainly also because of some changes in the feed, and we also see that when moving to a little bit higher body weight targets, we also see that fat deposition is becoming a bit better, which also can have an effect on the laying performance. But this is changing over time, and that can also have an effect on the nutritional requirements for energy and also amino acids. And in this talk, we'll address some trials that we did ourselves, also comparisons with the literature, if the current recommendations as we are having today, if these are still working for the broiler breeders. If we look at the body composition as such, but also performance of the broiler breeders, we see actually that most energy is directed for maintenance processes, so with maybe more protein deposition and changes in the requirements, that may also change over time, while we see that lysine amino acid recommendation, or amino acids are mainly used for egg production, but still a substantial amount is also used for maintenance. Depends a bit on the reference that we are using. This is an example from Colin Fisher from already some time ago. Depending on the sources that we use in type of studies, this might be a little bit different from trial to trial. What we also see, if we move a little bit beyond the lysine requirements, if we move to other amino acids, we also see there is a big variation in what amino acids are needed for maintenance, for growth, and also for egg production. And with these changes in body composition and over time, also these ratios might change. And also when you look at the recommendations of different breeding companies, you see that actually being reflected in the recommendations. Also, when we look at current performance, also over time, we have seen that these fat levels have become lower. In a number of cases, it also indicated that these fat levels might actually be marginal for sustaining a good laying performance. And birds tend to put more energy and nutrients in growth and breast meat than in fat deposition, but we see already that is changing a bit, and there's more focus on increasing fat deposition, especially during the rearing period. When we look at the body composition, we also can look a little bit further now, also fertility, hatchability, and offspring performance. Also there we can ask ourselves if the current recommendations for energy and amino acids are optimal for also a good hatchability and fertility and offspring performance. And in the examples I will give in the current presentation, I will give some examples of that, but in general, there's not a lot of effect of these different levels on hatchability and fertility. So for further improvements, we actually have to look in other directions than in changing the feed composition. Before moving first to the lysine requirements, first another example about more the relative amino acid requirements here, again for maintenance, for growth, and for egg production, where you can see, depending on the process, different amino acids are required. For instance, if you look at methionine cysteine, there is relative high requirement for maintenance and egg production, while, for instance, also valine, it's maintenance egg production, and lysine is a bit more in the direction of egg production. So we have changes in maintenance or body weight gain, or also egg production, that might also change the optimum ratios in the feed, and there we have seen over time that these ratios are changing. I will try to illustrate with a number of examples that what the how the recommendations are today maybe is not reflected what is needed by the birds, and I will try to make comparisons between our own work and some literature to show a little bit where the deficiency actually might be, and also some further work for future where we may have to focus at. Looking first at the lysine requirements, and I would say more the recent findings. Over time we see that actually requirements have increased. So I was also very curious last Monday about the new requirements from NRC, but these still have to be published. But I guess they will be a little bit higher than what we had before, but over time requirements have increased. And the majority of the trials actually have been done in the beginning or the first half of the laying period. When we look at the most recent presentations, there is a bit more, I would say, alignment with what we also see in the recommendations from the breeding company. So there we see that the results from trials and current recommendations are very close. And I think in general there's not a lot of debate about these levels. Sometimes we see with somewhat higher levels, we still might have a benefit on performance. I have one example of that. But basically there's not a lot of discussion about these requirements. Also looking at the breeder companies. Here on the right-hand side, you actually have a comparison with the current recommendations for avian birds and cob birds. On the right-hand side here, during the laying period, especially that start, that's very close what you also see in literature. So there's not a lot of debate, and then over time you see a little bit of difference. But I will show also one trial that we did ourselves, especially in the second half of the laying period, how these requirements might change with age. Looking at the rearing period, there we actually see we have gone in the opposite direction from what we see in the laying period. So over time, lysine requirements, or recommendations, maybe I should say, have become lower, a little bit higher for the first 2 weeks to get a good start, a good body conformation, but later on, levels have dropped rapidly, lower than where they used to be before, also to optimize the body composition and to prevent a high growth rate. We see differences between the breeding companies, but it also may have to do with differences in fat deposition and also fleshing targets that the different breeding companies have. On the left-hand side, you see an example of energy. I will address energy later on, but also you see there that the direction is a bit opposite from what we have seen in the laying period. We have moved over time to somewhat lower energy levels in the rearing period. Partly because of stimulating or prolonging the feed consumption time, but also there to reduce the body weight gain, the protein deposition to a certain extent. What I will do now is first look at the lysine requirements, also show 2 trials that we did ourselves. Then we'll move to the amino acid ratios, how that has changed over time, but also based on some trials, I hope to demonstrate a little bit that what we are doing today might be different looking at some other trials, and give some recommendations also what it could be for the laying period before we move to energy and body composition during the laying period. First we'll have a look at some own trials that we did. So for the laying period, the lysine recommendations literature, it's actually quite in line, so there's not a lot of debate about that. But if you look at the rearing periods, but also the second half of the laying period, not a lot of work has been done there. So I would like to show you 2 trials that we did internally. One trial with different levels of lysine and protein to energy in the rearing period, looking also what has the effect on body composition and performance. And in the other trial, we were gradually reducing the amount of lysine and also protein in the laying period, with the objective first to find out basically what can be the requirements in that second half, where there's less literature, but also are we better able to control exercise when we are going a little bit further down with the lysine levels. In both trials, ROS 308 birds were used, and in both trials we also maintained body weight targets of the breeding company. And also in both trials we had to adjust a little bit the feed intake to maintain the birds also on body weight targets. But what we learned also from that, you can actually feed broiler breeders quite strange feeds, but as long as we keep them on the body weight target, we still can have a good performance. Both trials also indicate there is a link with the body composition. So that's also something we take more into account with our current recommendations, and the most important thing is to allow feed allowance in time in order to keep birds on the body weight target. With that, we tend to have a good performance, even with very strange feeds. Looking a little bit also more on fertility, hatchability issues. If you look at our own trials, we do not see a clear effect on the fertility and hatchability, as I will show in the trials later on. The only thing that we see also in literature and also in our own work, if we go to very low protein levels, then we tend to see a negative effect on the hatchability, but then you have to be below 11.5, 10.5% of protein before you actually will see that effect. First now, I will go to the trials that we did ourselves. First, a trial with different lysine to energy ratios. You see here what we call then a standard, which is, you can always debate what should be the standard, but we had a standard. And we went 5% higher up to 20% lower. I will show in the, let's say, also here in the graph where we actually were, if you compare it with the current recommendations for the ROS 308 and also for the COP 500. ROS tends to be even a little bit lower in these first weeks after the starter phase, but on average, they were about 15% what was tested in that trial. What we see from this trial, birds were kept all on the same body weight target, so we ended up with the same body weight. But what we see, if we go lower with the lysine levels, protein, we see a lower breast meat and we see a higher fat deposition. So by changing the feeds, we were actually able to get different body compositions with the same body weight target, and we saw actually there was an effect on the performance in the laying period. I have here the performance on average in the laying period, but what we found the most striking effect, here we have the treatments in the rearing period again. In the laying period, all the birds got the same feed, so there were no differences in feed during the laying period, but what we saw to keep the birds on the body weight target, we had to feed the lean birds quite some more feed than the birds that were more fat. So that body composition as such has an effect on also the amount of feed that we have to feed, and if we don't know the body composition very well, we can actually be off with the amount of feed that we provide to the birds. That can have negative effects on the performance. Looking at a laying percentage, we tended to have more or less the best laying percentage in the somewhat intermediate levels, around that 10% lower than what was here the standard, which is a little bit higher than the current AVIA-Gen recommendations. That tended to give the best performance. And that main effect came actually in the second half of the laying period. And I have here the visualization of the different treatments during the laying period, where the worst performance, actually the worst persistency, was obtained with the birds that had the most body lean mass at the beginning of the laying periods. And these intermediate birds, they actually gave the best persistency, like the 10% lower, which is a bit higher than the current AVIA-Gen recommendations. And also when we compare with other trials, there's a nice work both from Edgar Eviedo Rondon and Rick van Eemars. They went about 10% lower. Also they found a better laying percent, also again better persistency in line with what we did. But here we also see that if we go too low, there is actually a negative effect on the persistency. Fertility and hatchability were not affected in this trial. We actually had in this particular trial very good fertility and hatchability data, which is higher than you see in the field. And for comparison, I have here some field data from last year that we have from internal and also from a number of customers. It's more European, South America and also Asia-based data that we have here, where the hatching egg production is around this 175 to 180 birds with around 150 chickens per breeder at 60 weeks of age, with around 84–86% of fertility, which is quite different from what you see here in the US. So there might also be other reasons that you have these deviations here, that looking at the feed composition, there is in that sense not a lot to gain. You have to do really strange things with the feed before you will see these negative effects on fertility and also hatchability, and it might be more also some management examples that might be more important here. So we saw an effect on the laying performance, and then the intermediate levels gave the best laying performance. Also when we look at the offspring performance, also here this is your female birds On the left-hand side, when we had the intermediate levels, it also gave the best laying percentage. We also tend to see that these have the best offspring performance, best feed intake. That is translating into the best daily weight gain. Both the lowest and the highest protein levels, the protein to energy ratio, gave the lowest performance. And also comparing this with some literature data, there's another trial from the rearing period where also different energy to protein ratios were done, and you actually have to compare here the right-hand side with the left-hand side and the other way around. But there, a very similar pattern was observed in this particular trial, so it seems to be a quite consistent effect. You can say 2 trials is maybe not that consistent, but there are indications that everything is moving in the same direction, where we see that around 10%, so that's a little bit higher, 5% higher than the current AVRDN recommendations seem to give the best performance in the birds. Looking more at the laying period, there we actually had a trial where we went down from the standard feeding program to rather low levels at the end with the aim to control body weight. And we went to that 10.5% in the last phase because there are some indications from literature that that still could work. So we took a guess and we gradually reduced the lysine level and also the protein level a little bit in the same ratio. Also here we aimed at the same body weight targets as the breeder recommendations, but here we also had some other trials that we kept the birds on a 500 gram higher body weight at the end of the rearing period and maintained that level also during the laying period, but we didn't see any significant interactions, no indications that these higher body weights also needed another lysine to energy ratio. But we did see some other things. And what we saw, I've summarized in this particular slide. Here you, on the left-hand side, you see the feed intake or the feed allowance. And what we saw then, we went below this 12.5%, 12.2% of protein, let's say below the 0.51 lysine. Then we actually saw we needed to give the birds more feed to maintain their body weight, indicating that we had some deficiencies there. And when we went further down, we had to further increase the feed allowance to maintain the body weight. Laying percentage as such was not affected. Was a small tendency of a little bit better persistency, but we saw a clear effect on the egg weight, that with these lower protein lysine levels, we had a clear reduction in the egg weight, so it was better, easier to control the egg weight. On average, fertility, hatchability data were not affected. With an exception of one of the trials, we do every 2 weeks we do hatchability trials. When we saw with the very low or the low CP below that 12%, we actually saw a significant negative effect on hatchability, which is again in line with some of the work that Rick van Emos did. Also there, when they moved to very low protein levels, also in the second half of the laying period, they had a significant reduction of hatchability, while overall, average, it was not significant, but especially in that last period, there was a significant negative effect on hatchability. So when we move it to the extremes, only then we tend to see a negative effect on the hatchability. As mentioned, there were 2 different body weight classes. Here and here I have put all the body weight classes, the normal birds and the birds with the 500 grams higher body weight. That higher body weight, and that we see in more trials, translates into a better egg production. So on average, for every 100 grams body weight gain, we see 1 extra egg. So then it depends a little bit on the cost of the feed and the hatching egg, if that is an attractive strategy. But also here, at the end, with the higher body weight, we still saw with the lower protein diets, we had to increase the feed allowance. Maybe not as much as in the standard body weights. There was no significant interaction, but also there we had to increase the feed allowance to maintain that body weight. Overall, no effects on the egg numbers, the laying percentage, but also here, there was a very similar effect on egg weight. Also with these heavier birds, there was a very similar effect on the egg weight reduction when we moved to these lower protein. Here, there was no significant interaction at all. So these effects looked pretty similar across different body weight classes. We also had a look at the offspring performance. Is there still something we can optimize or have to be careful with? And what we saw here, if we had the standard protein with the reduced protein, we saw a significant reduction in the day-old body weight, which was very similar again with some earlier reported work. I made a comparison here with the treatments because the ratios are here the opposite around from what we tested here in the our own trial, but looking at day-old body weight, looking at these protein levels in the laying period, you see some very similar effects. And we saw, unfortunately, in this work, no grow-out trial was performed. But when we look at our own work, we see that these effects at day 0 are maintained until the end of the grow-out period. Still there you have a significant reduction in the body weight of the chicken. So going very low in protein will have a negative effect also on the offspring performance. Looking overall at the lysine requirements, there we can actually say that the recent estimates that we also see from literature are very well in line with also what we see from the breeding companies. And we see that when looking at the rearing period, reducing lysine actually has a good effect on the body conformation, less breast meat and more body fat. And we see around that 10% compared to what we had in the control group, which is slightly higher what we see in the Ross recommendations, about 5% higher, seems to give the best overall laying performance. There also is an effect on the offspring, which seems to have its origin actually in the rearing period. I will show another trial that was also done in the laying period. Similar effects, but they were very similar to when you do it with the rearing period alone, actually stressing that importance of that rearing period. And this is actually very much in line with other work that we did with diluted diet, where we also had an effect on offspring performance, but also that had its origin in the rearing period. When we were only applying that in the laying period, we did not see that effect on offspring performance, and when we were only using the diluted diets in the rearing period, we did see that effect on the offspring performance, giving a little bit similar picture as this trial with these protein to energy ratios, that there is an effect of the rearing period on the offspring performance. What we also saw during the laying period, we can have a reduction of the protein, and probably around at 12.5% in the second half of the laying period. That seems to be more or less the critical level, around this 0.552. That still seems to be the minimum level for the second half of the laying period, but I'll show you in a few slides another example that it's probably a little bit different from what we concluded from our own trial, that it still can be a little bit lower, but then with higher protein, because we think that some other amino acids are actually limiting than we currently take into account in our daily feed formulation. Going now there, looking at other requirements, we actually see there is a wide variation in literature reported about amino acid to lysine requirements. There we see a lot more variation, also limited work done on that. And we also see that the requirements or the ratios can actually depend also on the method that has been used to estimate these ratios of other amino acids to the lysine level. There are some performance-based trials for dose response. Some are more based on nitrogen balance, or other modeling has been used as well. But also with some of the modeling exercises, we see that results can be very dependent on the input data. What are the profiles used for maintenance, for instance, or also for some conversion of digested amino acids in the body that can all result in different ratios. Internally, for our own recommendation, we still tend to follow more the trial performance data instead of some modeling exercises. I think there's good progress also in the modeling going on, but we still have to do some fine-tuning, especially more in the conversion of some amino acids, to get a profile that we think is reflecting also the profile that might be optimal for performance. Looking at the ratios, we also see very big differences between the breeding companies. I have here just one example of a comparison of the current Ross and also COP recommendations, where you see that the COP recommendations of amino acids compared to lysine, this is methionine and cysteine compared to lysine, are quite constant, while you see much higher ratios in the rearing periods in the Aviagen recommendations. I think that also has to do with the relatively low lysine levels. If you then formulate your normal feeds, you will get higher levels of all the other amino acids with the current raw materials that we are using. That is working well. That doesn't have to mean that actually are the requirements. It's working well is something different than what are the requirements, but we have seen in practice this can work well. We still think that the requirements actually are lower than what's used here, but for these lower lysine levels in the practical formulation, this seems to work pretty well. I would like to give one example compared to some own work that we did about amino acid ratios in the laying period, and that things might be a little bit different than what we think it is today. This is an example of work that was done by Serate and colleagues from the Aviagen team. They compared actually what at that time were the recommendations for the ROS 308 with a modeling exercise, which resulted overall in somewhat lower lysine levels compared to the current or the guide as it was, and also in much higher ratios of other amino acids compared to lysine, compared to the other practical guidelines. When they did that lower lysine level during the laying period compared to the somewhat higher according to the recommendations, but higher ratios for almost all other amino acids, they actually did not see any effect on hatching egg production. When we are comparing that with our own trial, we were already seeing negative effects at around 0.51 lysine. Here you see that 0.43 in the second half is still okay. So there seemed to be some room, but it was very different in this trial. In our own trials, we went a little bit lower, more down with the protein, and here protein overall stayed a little bit higher, also indicating there were other amino acids also at higher levels in these feeds. That brings us to more or less the conclusion that probably some other amino acids are limiting, other than what we currently use in the feed formulation, and that's actually exactly the same what we are finding in our laying hen trials, that if we are looking at the requirements, that something else is limiting than the list of amino acids that you see here. And we have been trying to identify, also with modeling exercises, what are the next limiting amino acids, but when we are then running the trials, it still appears it's something else that is coming, then it's following from the modeling exercises. So we still think that probably, also for the broiler breeders, we still have to use either a minimum total amino acid or a total non-essential pool as a sort of minimum, and then it looks like somewhere between 0.45 and 0.5 in that second half of the laying period with around 13% of protein. That seems to be the absolute minimum that we can use in the second half of the laying period, resulting also in a better control of egg weights. Looking at the amino acid ratios, and then we'll very quickly through the energy, then we see actually for the amino acid ratios there's a large variation, which is also coming from the different methods that are being used. And looking at modeling exercises, we see that progress is being made, that estimates are getting more close to also some of the performance studies. But also there it depends very much which are the sources or the articles or references that are used, for instance, for the amino acid profile for maintenance. What we also see that due to the current low levels already, especially in the rearing period, and the current use of raw materials, we normally are already over-formulating for the other amino acids. So it's relatively difficult to find the requirements for these other amino acids. So relatively high ratios might work in practice because basically we are already over-formulating. Combining our own trial with also the work of Serate, we see actually that lysine can be a little bit lower than what we have found in our own trials. And it looks also combining the work again with recent work we have been doing with laying hens, not only ourselves, but also in other research facilities. There's a project also running with Wageningen University on this. Then we see that it's probably the other amino acids that are limiting, none of the ones that we are taking into account in current feed formulation. So either we have to take into account a total pool of amino acids or non-essentials that may be set for the second half of the laying period for the broiler bees. It looks like it's around 13% and around that 0.45, 0.5 as the minimum requirements to also control the egg weight. At the end, a little bit more about energy. That might be a little bit easier since we see more consistent results there. Again, going back to the earlier slide, we see that for maintenance, relatively high requirements for energy. Also for egg production, we still need energy, but the main requirements are coming from the maintenance. Looking at literature, early performed data, then we see there's actually less published about energy requirements, in some cases also modeling exercises, but there we see actually the requirements or the recommendations are relatively flat, and also when you look again at the laying period, they are very close to what we currently are using today. So basically there's not a lot of debate, I think, in general, looking at the laying period about these requirements. Looking at the rearing period, there you've seen a little bit the other move that we are moving towards lower and lower levels in the rearing period. There are a few recent examples. I would like to give one because it's very much in line with some other work that has been published. This is work from PhD work from Jesse Heijmans from Wageningen University, where they actually have been studying different effects, different energy levels, keeping the protein level the same. And what was nice from these trials, with the higher energy, less feed also had to be provided to keep the burst on the body weight, but with the higher energy to protein levels, actually there was more body fat, which we were expecting was going to be translated also in a better number of eggs. That's actually not what you see in this particular work. Here we have again the different energy to protein ratios, so from 4% lower to 8% higher, and then moving to that higher amount of energy. This was done in both the rearing and the laying period. And then you see actually there is an effect of the total eggs. That's actually the opposite almost from what we have seen when you do that in the rearing period only. And what is happening here, or at least what we think is happening here, that with these higher energy levels, if you increase the energy level but keep the protein the same, lysine the same, you have to feed the less to keep the burst on body weight, and actually by that you almost get a deficient state for the lysine intake. This is quite lower than what we are. And we also see there's still some positive effect when we go a little bit higher. So moving a little bit higher than where we are today might be actually good, or at least is not negative for the number of eggs. But you see actually here there's a clear difference if you do the different protein to energy ratios in the rearing period alone, or in this case in both the rearing and the laying period, you see two different effects. Also here there was again an effect on offspring, mainly from the lowest energy to protein ratio. So when you have a relatively high amount of protein, also here there is a negative effect on offspring. In our own work we already saw this, doing this in the rearing period alone, but in this particular case, combining both the rearing and the laying period, you see a similar effect. So when we look at the energy requirements, we see that that is actually relatively stable, very close to what we are feeding the birds today. So no, I would say very little debate about that. If you look at the different guidelines or recommendations for the rearing period, there you will see differences, which can also relate to the body weight targets, body composition targets that the breeding companies have. What we also have seen, and yesterday in the presentation from Aviagen in the welfare session, was that lower densities actually can be used to increase feed consumption time. What we have seen in some more recent work, here we have an example from Annemarie Mens, is that in recent trials with normal raw materials or oat hulls, there is not a lot of effect on welfare parameters. But yesterday we got also in that Aviagen presentation an example of straw pellets that seem to have more effects. So maybe with that also the diluted diets are back on the agenda to actually increase feed consumption time. And in earlier work also from Rick van Emaus, it was shown that if you have lower lysine to energy, also that can give an effect on the consumption time. But that might be related to the genetic lines, as we also see that dose response studies, lysine in broiler chickens actually give very different effects on feed intake. We see also higher energy, if you move to a little bit higher energy in both the rearing and the laying periods. We see actually that that can have a positive effect on hatchability when we still have target body weights, but we did not see this when we were doing that in the rearing period only. When we combine the different trials, we see there is an effect of these energy to amino acid ratios on the body composition. Also, that is also affecting the amount of feed that we need to maintain body weight targets. And also that is suggesting that this body weight or the body composition as such has a large impact also on the requirements. And more recent work is also indicating work so far has mainly focused on body composition in the rearing period, but we also see there are clear effects on changes in body composition during the laying period, and that may further affect the requirements. And then to finalize, I would like to show you two slides before coming to the overall conclusions, where we are comparing the pattern in development in broiler breeders with also what we recently found in laying hens. And the first examples are work from the group of Dr. Kuhn, where we see that actually during the laying period, the amount of protein first is going down, but towards the end of the laying period, the protein deposition is going up at the expense of the fat composition. And recent work that we are doing in our own research center, we see similar patterns also in laying hens, so it looks a more fundamental pattern. And also one of the questions is then, should we further change the feed in the in the laying period to optimize also body composition in the laying period? We do not have an example yet of that in broiler breeders. We have started actually in laying hens, and this is the example before we get to the conclusions, is that we see that if we are changing the feed composition, whether it's with reduced energy or with reduced lysine, we see significant changes or tendencies to changes that are affecting actually the laying persistency. So we see with a higher amount of protein, at the end of the laying period, we get a better persistency, and we see a similar effect with the body fat. If that's also higher, at the end of the laying period, we see a better laying persistency. So now the question is, if we do further adaptations, is that also working for our broiler breeders? We have some indications from field trials it's actually working, that in some cases at the end of the rearing period we are already going to higher energy levels. That is translating into a better persistency. So that might be also linked to the changes in the body composition, but we think this is also one of the future directions we should go to optimize the performance. So getting more to the conclusion of some more recent work on amino acid and energy requirements in broiler breeders, that we see in the laying period, current digestible lysine recommendations are very close to what we see also in the literature, and in the rearing period it has gone in another direction to optimize the body composition. But sometimes we may have to deviate also therefore from the breeder recommendations in order to optimize the body composition. With most of the trials with energy and lysine, there's no effect on the fertility and hatchability, so that changing that here will not solve the problems here in the US. And we only have seen that with very low protein levels, we see that negative effect on the hatchability. We see that recommendations for other amino to lysine actually have changed over time. They all have become higher, but when we look at the laying period, we think actually that other amino acids are limiting. So we still may have to use a minimum for the amount of protein or non-essential amino acids in our current feed formulation, and there's actually room to go to lower other amino acid to lysine ratios there. We see that body composition has an impact on the performance, and with that again, the optimal body composition may result in different lysine and also energy levels than what we normally see in the breeding recommendation. We think we should closely monitor that and make adjustments where required. And also, when we look at the body composition during the laying period, we see indications coming mainly from our laying hens that also they're changing or moving to higher protein deposition and or fat deposition at the end of the laying period can help to improve the laying persistency, and especially on that topic, also further work is in progress to get to a better body composition. And in the meantime, we're also looking more at the modeling exercises. What can we improve there to get a better estimate for the other amino acids? Thank you very much for your attention.